Welcome to the True Crime Man's Dark Imagination YouTube channel, your one destination for the most factual, engrossing profiles of crime on the internet. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you'll receive future notifications of upcoming episodes. And tell your friends about us.
In the annals of American crime, there are a few cases that cause historians and true crime aficionados to shudder with horror and disbelief. Our presentation is just one of those cases. In recent years, a great deal of attention has been paid to the case of HH Holmes and his murder castle. Although he had been blamed for as many as 200 deaths, historical documentation demonstrates he had far less. But it is his criminal behavior and actions that draw attention to his misdeeds and dispel some of the false assumptions made throughout history of this man that many have labeled the first American serial killer.
On May 7th, 1896, at the Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the condemned man stood on the scaffold, waiting for the executioner to pull the lever, thus ending his life. He set the record straight, had confessed to the deaths of 27 people, and when the phrase was included in the vocabulary of law enforcement, he became known as the first serial killer in American history. But are the facts that we have come to accept about this despicable individual actually the facts as they occurred? The condemned man waiting for his execution was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, to parents Levi Morton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Mudgett's parents were the first English immigrants in that area at that time. Webster was the third child, with an older sister, older brother, and a younger sister. Raised in a devout Methodist atmosphere, Webster's father worked various occupations such as a farmer, trader, and a house painter. As a young child, some bullies taunted Mudgett to the point of pushing him into a doctor's office, where a skeleton hung in the corner of the office. Instead of being frightened, Webster became fascinated with human anatomy. Little is known of Webster's childhood, but at the age of 16, he married Clara Lovering Alton, who bore Webster a son on February 3, 1880, Robert Lovering Mudgett. At the age of 18, after leaving the University of Vermont, Webster enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School and worked in the anatomy lab. History records that at the same time, Webster began to violently beat his wife, causing her to leave him in 1884. While attending medical school, Mudgett found money scarce and formulated schemes that brought him enough money to stay in school and pay tuition. One of these schemes involved selling cadavers from the school's coffers. Webster graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School just barely in 1884 and continued selling cadavers. After leaving the college, Webster stole corpses from the anatomy lab in order to perfect a dishonest practice that Webster made an art form for at the time. He would steal the corpses, disfigure them, then claim that he had purchased a life insurance policy on the dead body. Thus, he conned the insurance companies out of money for this fraudulent practice, a practice he continued throughout his adult life. Mudgett had a partner for this insurance scam, and in one instance, he claimed to have a body they could pass off as one of the insureds. The partner backed out, and Mudgett was stuck with the corpse. He stored the body in a barrel where he was living, and when the smell became too great, he buried the corpse in his basement. It would have been a hard sell to authorities had the young doctor been caught with a freshly deceased corpse in a barrel in his room. Also, after graduation, Webster moved to Chicago, Illinois, and began working in the pharmacy industry. At this time, Mudgett decided to use an alias for which history would later condemn him, Dr. Henry H. Holmes. Once he assumed the alias, Holmes engaged in crooked real estate deals, promotional campaigns, and corrupt business operations. Even though Holmes already married in 1880, he later married Myrta Z. Belknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota on January 28, 1887. The couple produced a daughter, Lucy Theodate Holmes, born on July 4, 1889, in Englewood, Illinois. The problem? Holmes had now become a bigamist. It appeared that Holmes ignored the law in everything he did, and the family of three lived in an affluent area of Chicago known as Wilmette. Although Holmes produced children, Holmes would never be known as a, quote, family, end quote, man. He tended to his businesses in the city rather than spending quality time with his young family or any other children he sired in the past. He set up a room at his place of employment and very rarely went to visit his family in the suburbs. Holmes filed for divorce from his first wife after marrying the second one, but the divorce with Clara never materialized. At this time, Holmes married another woman, Georgiana Yoke, on January 9, 1894. At the same time, Holmes carried on a relationship with the wife of a former employee, Ned Connor. Connor's wife, Julia Smith, became Holmes' lover, although he was still married to other women. During one of his many trips into the city of Chicago, Holmes saw a business opportunity through Dr. E. S. Holton's drugstore. Holmes wrangled his way into a job at the business. Dr. Holton happened to be dying from cancer, and his wife took over the store. Holmes managed to convince Mrs. Holton into letting him purchase the store from the Holtons. There was a caveat, however. Holmes had it stipulated in the bill of sale that after the demise of Dr. Holton, Holmes would be allowed to live in the upstairs apartment. After Dr. Holton passed, Holmes took up residence in the upstairs apartment. Although historical records strongly surmise that Holmes murdered Mrs. Holton and then took over the business, we still do not hear anything from Mrs. Holton from the historical record. Holmes informed relatives and friends that Mrs. Holton left unexpectedly to visit relatives in California. Then she decided to live there. No one ever really followed up on whether Mrs. Holton did exactly what Holmes related. Holmes then decided to build the ultimate chamber of horrors and make money from others' deaths. Across the street from the pharmacy stood a plot of land that convinced Holmes to build a hotel, but not just any hotel. Holmes envisioned a 3-story building, naming it, quote, the Castle, end quote. Primarily the rooms in the, quote, hotel, end quote, would be built with either soundproof rooms sealed with airtight atmospheres, or ones that had a, quote, body chute, end quote, where once persons were murdered, the bodies would be placed in the chute that ended in the basement. Always thinking about making money, Holmes had shops built on the ground floor so that he could collect rents while he murdered aimlessly, possibly collecting life insurance on the deceased, or robbing them of their valuables before murdering them wholesale. Several historians have raised questions as to whether Holmes actually ran the castle as a hotel. Although he may have built the 3rd floor of the castle to function as a hotel, it appeared that this was never actually used as one. Right as the building opened, Holmes' creditors came calling, an almost constant occurrence because Holmes never paid his bills, and repossessed most of the furniture. Even more convincing that Holmes was not the proprietor of a hotel, per se, is that during the course of the World Exposition of 1893, a fire broke out on August 13, 1893, and destroyed the 3rd floor of the castle. The building had to be evacuated, but the press never mentioned whether any, quote, hotel guests, end quote, were taken from the building. Although the evidence suggests that the building was not used as a hotel, this would not have been out of character for Holmes, seeing as he relished in coming to the rescue of females and then murdering them. Holmes' plan seemed to go like clockwork. In trying to find architects and builders to bring his plan to fruition, Holmes hired, then fired, builders and contractors as the construction progressed, keeping the secrets of the main purposes of the construction. In turn, bills went unpaid, and several people sued Holmes for the amounts owed on the work already accomplished. Completion of the, quote, castle, end quote, was just in time for the 1893 Chicago World's Exposition. The plans of the castle were very intricate. The upper 2 floors had Holmes' office and, quote, a maze of well over 100 windowless rooms, with doorways that would open to brick walls, oddly angled hallways, stairways to nowhere, doorways that could not be opened from the outside, and a host of other strange and labyrinthine constructions, end quote. Holmes took the extreme advantage of the castle and the fact that the World's Exposition would possibly see over 27 million visitors come to the Windy City to gasp at the marvels of modern science and the inventions that would soon cause citizens to embrace the 20th century. Over the next 3 years, Holmes had his pick of victims amongst the female employees of the premises during construction from the shops on the bottom floor. One of the conditions of their employment was that Holmes took out a life insurance policy on the employees once they started working for him. Holmes paid the premiums and made himself the beneficiary. The life insurance would eventually be paid after Holmes tortured and then killed his prey. Some of his victims suffered from asphyxiation when locked in soundproof and airtight rooms, when Holmes released natural gas into the rooms. Near his office, Holmes had installed a soundproof back vault, a place where victims would scream. Holmes could hear it and relish in the agony until the victim died. In order to make more money, Holmes put their bodies down the body chute to the basement, where he dissected, stripped them of all their flesh, wired the bones together to form a skeleton, then sold them to local medical schools. Also installed in the basement, Holmes contracted for 2 large furnaces to cremate bodies as well. Acid pits, bottles of poison, and a stretching rack adorned his chambers in the basement. Because of the misdeeds he conducted during medical school, connections were utilized to sell the skeletons, in addition to organs he procured from some of the bodies. Additionally, being a licensed physician under the name of Mudgett, Holmes performed illegal abortions in one of the more isolated rooms of the castle in the basement. In 1890, Ned Connors and his wife Julia and their daughter Pearl moved into Holmes' Wallace Street building. Connors made his living as a jeweler and did quite well for himself, so much so that Holmes offered to sell the building to Connors. When Connors purchased the building from Holmes, Holmes did not mention how much debt he had accumulated surrounding the building, and Connors discovered that Holmes and Julia had been having an affair for some time. Connors thought to himself that Holmes wanted to trade the building for his wife. When Connors found out about the affair, he quickly sold the building back to Holmes and then left the city. For months thereafter, people noticed this vibrant young woman and her little girl walking the streets around Wallace Street. Then, one day, Julia and Pearl disappeared. Holmes responded to queries to his neighbors regarding the woman and her child that they moved or went to visit family, never to return or be seen alive again. Soon after the disappearance of Julia and Pearl Connors, Holmes met a young lady that worked not too far from the castle at an alcoholism treatment center where Holmes' new partner, Benjamin Pitezel, took his treatments. Her name was Emmeline Sagrand. Sagrand was a secretary that worked in an office not too far from the castle. Holmes became so enamored with the young girl that he offered to hire her to work for him at double her salary. What young lady in that age would not have jumped at an offer like that? It is not readily apparent as to whether Holmes and Sagrand became intimate right away. Several of the people staying or working in the castle, of course, had their suspicions, at approximately Christmas 1892, a Mrs. Lawrence, one of Holmes' tenants, had a conversation with Sagrand just before she disappeared. Sagrand stated to Lawrence that she was thinking about leaving her job and Chicago. Mrs. Lawrence never saw her again. When Mrs. Lawrence confronted Holmes about where Sagrand had gone to, Holmes stated she married her fiancé, Robert Phelps, and left the city, never to return. Just then, Holmes produced a wedding card that appeared typed, as was not the fashion of the time. Most wedding announcements were handwritten. Mrs. Lawrence felt very uneasy due to the fact that she believed that Sagrand would have told her of such a romance, or even said goodbye before allegedly leaving. Later, Holmes produced a newspaper clipping that announced the wedding of Sagrand and Phelps. No one, at the time, suspected Holmes of any foul play. Mrs. Lawrence, who later testified at Holmes' trial, also related a moment that she witnessed at the castle. One night, Mrs. Lawrence witnessed Holmes, Benjamin Pitezel, and a new Holmes associate, Patrick Quinlan, carrying a trunk down the steps from the third floor of the castle and out of the building. Lawrence then firmly believed that Holmes murdered the young girl and then placed her into the trunk. In the mid-1880s, Holmes began using a different name when he met a woman named Minnie Williams. Known as, quote, Howard Gordon, end quote, Holmes discovered that Minnie Williams stood to inherit a large part of her mother's estate, and very soon in the near future. Minnie was described as a, quote, plain, end quote, girl who could be easily flattered. For Holmes, this, quote, rang the dinner bell, end quote, so to speak, and Holmes pounced. Over some time, Holmes first wooed the young girl, then he gained control over her finances, real estate, and eventually she signed over the whole fortune to the ne'er-do-well. When Williams moved to Chicago, Holmes insisted they marry, so they did. No record exists regarding this union. When Minnie contacted her older sister, Nanny, to have a reunion in Chicago, Holmes treated the sisters to a day of celebration where he got to meet his new sister-in-law. Nanny was the first of the sisters to disappear unexpectedly. Then, with Minnie and Pitezel to accompany him, Holmes traveled to Fort Worth, Texas to plan the building of another castle there. He planned to use one of Minnie's real estate possessions to build the new, quote, castle, end quote. One of the many myths that has circulated down through history is that Holmes was a prolific serial killer with more than 200 victims to his credit. At the time when some of the murders allegedly occurred, witnesses could place Holmes several states away. This, of course, has only been corrected fairly recently. Nevertheless, soon after the initial phase of construction ended in Fort Worth, Holmes left the city. One can surmise that both building projects, the murder castle in Chicago and the one in Fort Worth, served to con banks out of money, as Holmes never intended to pay any of it back in the first place. In any case, it appeared as though Minnie never left Texas. Later, when persons would see a female on Holmes' arm, this happened to be Benjamin Pitezel's wife, and not Minnie. In all likelihood, Holmes murdered Minnie in Texas and left the body there. Neither Minnie nor Nanny would ever be seen or heard from again. While returning to Chicago, Holmes got arrested in Colorado on fraud charges and spent the remainder of 1893 behind bars. Upon his release in January 1894, Holmes met and married his fourth and final wife, Georgiana Yoke. Again, Holmes changed his name to, quote, Mr. H. M. Howard, end quote, to project some sort of con on Georgiana. He informed his new love interest that his uncle left him vast tracts of land in his will under the condition that he would change his name, thus the, quote, Howard, end quote, moniker. In actuality, the land of which Holmes spoke belonged to Minnie Williams. While Holmes, quote, courted, end quote, Georgiana, Ben Pitezel, his wife Carrie, and their children, Desi, Howard, Nellie, Alice, and Wharton, moved to St. Louis, Missouri, perhaps in search of more lucrative schemes. Later, in 1894, Holmes contacted Pitezel requesting that the family man purchase a life insurance policy so that Holmes could fake his partner's death, replacing him with a medical cadaver. Pitezel then met Holmes, and the two traveled to Philadelphia. Pitezel told his wife of the plan, which was unusual because there is no evidence to suggest that he had ever done so before, even with the wildest of money-making schemes. But this time, Holmes planned something diabolical for the man who shared the secrets of his brutal and murderous existence. While Pitezel waited in Philadelphia for Holmes to find a corpse, the boredom and frustration became too much, and he drank until almost passing out. By the time Holmes caught up with Pitezel, the father of 5 was barely conscious. Holmes actually contributed to Pitezel's inebriation, implying him with more shots of alcohol. When Pitezel lost consciousness, Holmes overdosed his handyman with chloroform. He then tried to make Pitezel's death appear as an accident. First, he used the oil lamp in the room to burn some of Pitezel's hair. Then, he smashed the chloroform bottle on the floor. Holmes blamed an explosion for Pitezel's demise, and the coroner believed his story. In order for Holmes to collect on the life insurance policy that he acquired on Pitezel, he needed a family member to identify the body. Holmes reached out to Carrie Pitezel, Ben's wife, and asked that she journey to Philadelphia and identify the remains of her husband. Carrie Pitezel refused to leave her infant son and instead sent her 15-year-old daughter Alice to Holmes on a train. That would be the last time Carrie saw her daughter again. Alice felt uneasy about the trip, although her father, quote, worked, end quote, with Holmes for a long period of time. Alice believed there was something suspicious about the doctor, and that the rest of the family, including herself, never really knew Holmes. When Alice arrived in Philadelphia, Holmes picked her up at the train station, and the two immediately proceeded to the morgue. Covered with only a thin sheet, an attendant pulled back the sheet to reveal a charred, rotting corpse. There was no mistake that Benjamin Pitezel lay on that table after Alice identified the corpse by its teeth. The Fidelity Mutual Insurance paid Carrie Pitezel $7,500, but Holmes mentioned to her that her husband owed him $5,000. Carrie paid Holmes, but the conniver believed the Pitezel family knew too much and had to be taken care of immediately. Although Alice identified the body, Holmes pretended as though Ben Pitezel was still alive, and only Holmes knew where he resided. Holmes sent a letter to Carrie Pitezel and requested that she send more of her children to him in Philadelphia. Holmes stated to her that her husband was not dead, but hiding in Cincinnati, Ohio. If the whole Pitezel family were to travel to Cincinnati to visit their supposedly alive patriarch, it may draw suspicion to Holmes' plan. Carrie sent Howard, age 8, and Nellie, aged 11, to join Alice and Holmes in Pennsylvania. Carrie and the two remaining children, Desi and the baby Wharton, would wait a while longer before journeying to meet Holmes. One contemporary at the time stated that Holmes suffered from terrible nightmares, but that these nocturnal testimonies never lessened his ability to be cruel and inhumane. Holmes knew, then and there, what needed to be done with the Pitezel children. From September 28th to November 17th, 1894, Holmes had his hands full with navigating 3 groups of people around so that his plans would not be uncovered. Holmes and Georgiana, the 3 Pitezel children, and Carrie Pitezel, the baby Wharton, and Desi, were being pushed around the Midwest and Canada by Holmes with the hopes that his plans would remain secret. They traveled through the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Toronto, and finally Ogdenburg, New York. Whenever they arrived in a new city, the parties seemed to lose members. Howard Pitezel was the first to disappear. Alice wrote in a letter to her mother that Howard was no longer with them. Observers were not sure as to what Holmes told the children to quit asking about little Howard. Alice Pitezel demonstrated homesickness and held a very low threshold for the cold weather. Later, investigators learned that the homesick girl stayed only 3 blocks from her mother Carrie Pitezel, baby Wharton, and Desi. Carrie Pitezel believed that by sending her children ahead of her with Holmes, that they would be rejoining their father. In reality, Holmes murdered them not too long after they arrived in a particular city. The distraught wife soon arrived in Vermont and again received more requests from Holmes to send her more of her children. Finally, since Carrie Pitezel all but ignored Holmes' requests, he visited her in person. Holmes planned to murder Carrie through the actions he later documented. When he could not convince her any further to put her children in his care, he went to the basement in which Carrie, Desi, and Wharton had been staying. Later, down in the dank, deep cellar, he dug a large hole. Later, Carrie found a note instructing her to go down to the basement. When she trekked down to the cellar, she found the hole and a small bottle of nitroglycerin next to the hole. Carrie then realized that perhaps her children were not missing, but that Holmes disposed of them, and her husband, and planned to murder her as well. At this point, Holmes had become increasingly paranoid, believing that he may have been caught at any moment. What he didn't know was that the Fidelity Mutual Insurance Company sent detectives to follow him and the Pitezels for a long time. When the Holmes party crossed the border into Toronto, obviously the jurisdiction of the insurance company investigators ceased. However, once Holmes and the lot re-entered the United States, the investigators were hot onto his trail. After visiting Carrie Pitezel, Holmes journeyed to his hometown, Gilmanton, New Hampshire, where he met with his former wife Clara, their 15-year-old son Robert, and Holmes' parents. It has been surmised that Holmes developed an elaborate lie to get back in the good graces of his former wife when he told her that he had been involved in a terrible accident and that he had amnesia. While in the hospital convalescing, the staff informed him that his name was HH Holmes and that he fell in love with his nurse, Georgiana Yoke, before suddenly remembering that his name was Herman Webster Mudgett. Holmes proved convincing to his former family, and they believed his story. After a few days, Holmes stated he had to tend to some business in Boston and would return shortly. Holmes never returned to New Hampshire. On November 17, 1894, authorities arrested Holmes in Boston and charged him initially with horse theft, a crime he may have committed while visiting Texas. But when the insurance investigators caught up to him, the charges began to multiply. Then, Holmes realized he had to weave some tall tales. He stated to police that he and Pitezel developed a scheme to defraud the insurance company, but then Pitezel killed himself. In reorganizing his plan, Holmes stated that he had to make it look like an accident because he knew the insurance company would not pay out for a suicide. After all, Holmes pleaded, he was doing it for Pitezel's family and not for himself. Holmes also claimed that the Pitezel children were still alive and with his wife, Minnie Williams, in London. The police also arrested Carrie Pitezel because she had knowledge of the plan to defraud the insurance company. As Holmes and Carrie Pitezel sat in jail cells in Boston, Detective Frank Geyer endeavored to locate the Pitezel children. Detective Geyer and another investigator, Inspector Gary from the Fidelity Insurance Company, combed over hotel records, spoke with the proprietors of boarding houses, and other possible witnesses as to whether they saw Holmes and the children together. Police in Chicago, alerted that the Boston police held Holmes in their custody, began to search Holmes' Englewood building. When police went into the basement, reporters followed closely behind them and caused an explosion when someone's candle ignited an old fuel tank. Soon thereafter, Chicago police uncovered a vat filled with a strange chemical, later discovered to be gasoline, where they assumed Holmes stripped the human bodies of all their flesh. Furthermore, authorities found a scratched-up bench that appeared to have been used as a dissecting table. When police found a length of rope in a toolbox that belonged to Patrick Quinlan, they determined that the rope may have been used to hang dead bodies in the elevator shaft. Quinlan steadfastly denied that the rope was used for that purpose. Police also made a rather grisly discovery when they dug deeper in the basement: human bones doused with quicklime. The coroner determined that the bones probably belonged to a child no older than 10 years of age. This discovery convinced authorities that Holmes murdered Pearl Connor, but Holmes merely stated that he buried a rotting corpse. Law enforcement next looked to the basement stove, where they uncovered small particles of fabric and a watch chain, which investigators determined belonged to Minnie Williams. Detectives also found what they believed to be, quote, heavily burnt bones, end quote, but closer scrutiny proved that they were just burned pieces of clay and turkey bones. Back east, Inspector Gary and Detective Gray found a house that Holmes rented in Toronto. When they searched the basement, they found a small patch of disturbed earth. The two investigators began digging as quickly as possible, and at the bottom of this shallow hole, the detectives found a large trunk, the one that Carrie Pitezel described to them at her arrest. Mrs. Pitezel stated she packed it for the children before they left St. Louis. When Inspector Gary and Detective Geyer opened the chest, they found the bodies of Alice and Desi Pitezel. When Holmes heard that the investigators discovered the chest, he stated,
"Well, I guess they'll hang me for this."
Even though Holmes was suspected to be a serial killer, a term that would not be coined until the mid-20th century, people from all over the Chicago area claimed to have worked with him or had personal relationships with him within the time he spent in the, quote, Windy City, end quote. One author noted the entire population of Chicago had, quote, lost its collective mind, end quote. One man, Myron Chappell, claimed that he helped Holmes articulate the corpses to sell to medical schools, which could have implicated Chappell in the disposal of some of the bodies. Later, after police placed a lot of credence in Chappell's story, they discovered that Chappell was a drunk and a liar. The Chicago police became so embarrassed at having believed Chappell, they ceased interrogations altogether, or investigations into other locations that Holmes may have stayed. When all was said and done, police found no real tangible evidence to charge Holmes with anything. Back in Ohio, Inspector Gary and Detective Geyer questioned one of Holmes' old neighbors who, quote, recalled a moving wagon arrive at the vacant house next door, occupied by a boy, a man, and an enormous stove, end quote. When whisperings about the man, the boy, and the large stove reached the ears of the man, Holmes, he confronted the neighbor and informed her that he decided he would not take the house and she could keep the stove if she wanted it. Because of the neighbor's suspicion, Holmes abandoned his plans in Ohio. In Indianapolis, Inspector Gary and Detective Geyer located another house that he rented there and discovered that Holmes had purchased an identical stove to the one he left behind at the Ohio residence. But in this stove, the persistent investigators found some burnt clothes, photographs, human teeth, and, quote, the top of a skull belonging to a prepubescent boy, end quote. Later, these fragments would join Ben Pitezel's skull underneath the desk of the man that would later prosecute Holmes. Inspector Gary and Detective Geyer knew they had enough evidence to prosecute Holmes for murder, so they brought their findings to the district attorney who, in turn, filed charges against HH Holmes for the Pitezel murders. Always trying to show his intelligence, Holmes decided to write his autobiography from prison. He did this in the hopes that he could garner some sympathy from the jury. Although the prosecution had ample time to prepare, the defense team only had a month. Eventually, they quit, and Holmes decided to defend himself. People in the gallery marveled at Holmes' prowess in the courtroom. Perhaps he gained a lot of practice with the endless lawsuits he seemed to either ignore or fail to appear altogether. In the end, though, his attorneys returned, but it was the emotionally charged testimony of Carrie Pitezel that brought the, quote, whole courtroom to tears, end quote. Finding that Georgiana Yoke and Holmes were never legally married, the judge allowed her testimony against Holmes to be admitted into the record. For the first time, perhaps as an effect to influence the jury, Holmes broke down in tears when Yoke testified against him. Even though the evidence against him in the murder of Benjamin Pitezel proved circumstantial at best, His attorneys successfully argued that the incidents in Chicago had no bearing on the trial in Philadelphia. The jury convicted Holmes. Subsequent to this conviction, Holmes confessed to over 27 other murders, and then the legend began. Popular newspapers, such as William Randolph Hearst's New York World, known for the, quote, yellow journalism, end quote, perpetrated later that stoked the fire for the U.S. entering the Spanish-American War in 1898, printed the rumors about Holmes as fact. The newspaper eventually began a long association with the convicted murderer, providing him with a column and eventually paying him $7,500 for his full confession. Later investigation of Holmes' quote, confession, end quote, revealed that some of the 27 people he claimed to have murdered were still alive at the time of his trial and death. Some speculated that Holmes confessed for such a large sum, leave to his wives and children. No one really believed that Holmes could be that altruistic. A more likely explanation was that he prepared for an appeal, and appeals are and were expensive. Holmes was reported to have claimed,
I was born with the evil standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me ever since.
But some researchers doubt these as Holmes' factual words. Even though Holmes hoped that an appeal would bring him a new trial, his options quickly ran out. Finally, on May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. The convicted murderer requested that his body be buried under concrete so that no harm would come to his corpse. Over the next 125 years, the Holmes legend grew to the point where the facts became lost in the resurgence of the gore. Many of the legends surrounding Holmes have since been disproven. For example, the fact that Holmes cheated death proved untrue, as in 2017, Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology exhumed Holmes' body to determine if he actually cheated death. Monge concluded, through dental records, that the man buried within Holmes' grave was, in fact, Herman Webster Mudgett, aka HH Holmes. After Holmes' death, rumors began to circulate that he cursed those that captured and eventually convicted him. Dr. William K. Martin, coroner's physician who had been a major witness against Holmes at the trial, died suddenly from blood poisoning shortly after Holmes' body was buried. Michael Arnold, the trial judge, and lead coroner, Dr. Ashbridge, both contracted deadly illnesses and succumbed a short time later. Howard Perkins, the prison superintendent at Moyamensing, where Holmes spent his final days and who presided over Holmes' execution, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Then, the father of one of Holmes' victims was horribly burned in a gas explosion, and the remarkably healthy Frank Geyer suddenly became ill. Detective Geyer subsequently overcame his illness and survived. After those deaths, the office of the claims manager for the insurance company that Holmes had cheated caught fire and burned. Everything in the office was destroyed except for a framed copy of Holmes' arrest warrant and 2 portraits of the killer. Mrs. Anna Harvey of Chicago, who lived in the murder castle, committed suicide. The fiancé of Holmes' lawyer, Samuel P. Rotan, died suddenly. A priest who had prayed with Holmes before his execution was found dead in the church courtyard. The coroner ruled the death as uremic poisoning, but according to reports, his body was found badly beaten and robbed. The jury foreman, Linford L. Biles, was electrocuted in a strange accident involving power lines above his house.
At the point when Holmes was executed, the hangman placed the knot directly behind the condemned man's neck rather than behind the right ear. When the executioner pulled the lever to release the trap door, Holmes hung there for about 15 minutes, suffocating to death rather than having a broken neck. Some deemed the punishment to be apropos for such a heinous and deceitful killer. In recent years, one of Holmes' descendants made a spectacular claim by stating that Holmes was also Jack the Ripper. His evidence, he claims, points to the fact that Holmes journeyed to England in late 1888 at the time when the murders took place in Whitechapel. Obviously, one only has to look at a calendar to determine this. The first murder took place in August, and there were others spread out until the last occurring on November 9th, 1888. In July of 1889, Holmes had a daughter born, Lucy Thomas. If we retrace his steps, Holmes had to be there for the conception in October of 1888. Additionally, this descendant also claims that the Dear Boss and Saucy Jack letters, written and sent to the Central News Agency at the time of the Ripper murders, were both written by Holmes. It has already been determined that a journalist by the name of Fred Best in 1931 stated that he and a journalist colleague had written the letters. One observer wrote that the descendant's claim is, quote, far-fetched and absurd, end quote. Furthermore, when you examine the signatures of the murders committed in Whitechapel with those that Holmes stood convicted, Holmes, according to the observer, was, quote, a cold-hearted swindler who specialized in insurance fraud, end quote. The victims attributed to Holmes were people that he knew, not random strangers that were laid butchered in the streets. The observer concluded that over the years there have been many who stood accused of being the elusive Jack the Ripper, with the same, quote, tortured and selective use of evidentiary fragments now being used to champion the case of Mudgett Holmes, end quote. What we do know is that the law finally caught up with Holmes on that May morning in 1896, and the person buried in Holmes's grave is Holmes, aka Herman Webster Mudgett. Until next time.
If you enjoyed our presentation of true crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any future programs.